Oh, guess what?
Yeah.
Taylor's going to the birthday party. Please go.
Yeah.
When is the break? When is the drug center thing?
It's Saturday.
Hello there, Rabbi. Nice to see you. You're muted. You're muted.
How are you, Dr. Pelcovitz?
Hi, good to see you.
Wonderful to see you as well. We'll start momentarily, okay?
Great.
How have you been?
Thank God. Thank God.
Baruch Hashem, okay.
How are things there?
Everything is quite well.
Good. Thank God.
Baruch Hashem, everything is well. We've never had the pleasure of having you in person at our show one day.
Okay, one day. It's not. I'm sure it's never hard to get people to come to your neighborhood, right?
Exactly. Hello. Okay, good evening, everyone, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight we are honored and delighted to have with us Dr. David Pelcovitz. And I've had the good fortune of knowing Dr. Pelcovitz for many years. So I'm delighted that for the first time he'll be speaking to our community. And we'll talk about the topic in a moment, but first let me tell you about Dr. Pelcovitz. Dr. David Pelcovitz holds Gwendolyn and Joseph Straus Chair in Psychology and Education at the Yeshiva University's Azrieli Graduate School, where he also teaches pastoral psychology courses and is special assistant to the president of the university. There's some background noise. I'm not sure where it's coming from, but if anyone has their idea what it is, they can disclose it. Before assuming his position on the faculty of Yeshiva University, Dr. Pelcovitz was a clinical professor of psychology and psychiatry at New York University School of Medicine and director of psychology at North Shore University Hospital-NYU School of Medicine for over 2 decades. He has published and lectured extensively on a variety of topics, including parenting, child abuse, trauma, and loss. Now, tonight's topic, which Dr. Pelcovitz will address for, I would say, approximately 30 to 40 minutes if possible, and then open up for about 10 or 15 minutes of questions at the end, is building resilience during re-entry from COVID, Jewish and psychological perspectives. Just today, the CDC announced here in Florida that if you are fully vaccinated, you can gather indoor and outdoor without any masks and any social distancing. The restrictions have been lessening with time. And while many people have been coming back to shul, there are still those that are not comfortable. And whether this is an emotional, psychological, or whatever kind of a barrier it is, everyone feels a little bit of hesitancy and perhaps discomfort, getting too close to people. We don't know, what the right measure of contact is. And so building resilience during re-entry from COVID, thank God we're at the phase where we're re-entering into society, into community post-COVID. And Dr. Pelcovitz will help us with dealing with the Jewish and the psychological perspectives. But one of the things I'd like to ask Dr. Pelcovitz, and I didn't really discuss this with him in advance, but in light of the 2 tragedies that have befallen the Jewish people since the time we scheduled this course, one was the tragedy in Miron, and one is the ongoing conflict right now in Israel and the firing of rockets into Israel. At Dr. Pelcovitz's discretion, since we are talking about resilience and Jewish and psychological perspectives of dealing with trauma and post-trauma and COVID was a traumatic experience for everyone. We lost a lot of wonderful people, and a lot of people suffered greatly. Perhaps if there's cross currents between processing what we're witnessing now in Israel, which comes so close on the heels of the tragedy of Meron, if you feel free to venture into those subjects to broaden the topic tonight from resilience during entry from COVID and coping with the news coming out of Israel, which is frightening news on a daily basis. So again, we'll leave time at the end for questions and answers. If you have questions as the presentation goes along, feel free to type your questions in and I'll present them to Dr. Pelcovitz at the end. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. David Pelcovitz.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the warm introduction. And I will. I think it's very important that let me I'm not sure if it's coming from me. I'll shut my phone just in case. Okay. So what I'm going to start with is I think I'd like to focus first on exactly what the rabbi is asking me to focus on, which is, we're all focusing now on the tremendous pain that comes with the losses in Meron, which is very complicated and very difficult to relate to, especially given what Meron has always symbolized for us. And then more immediately, kind of hard to focus on a day like today, and since what seems for all intents and purposes to be a war in Israel, where we're subject on all fronts to so many attacks. And what are the ingredients for resilience in the face of that kind of that kind of a double hit, which is embedded at a time that we're already shaky because of coming off of an extended period of time with the loss and chronic stress that comes with COVID. So I'll share a few general points. First one is rather obvious, but I think important to say. What all the research shows is that one size doesn't fit all when it comes to coping. And that's, I think, a very important thing to hold on to. Going back over the millennia, in the Talmud, there's a fascinating thought about how to deal with uncertainty, how to deal with times of where we're living on very shaky ground. And it's a disagreement between Rav Ami and Rav Asi on the pasuk, on the verse in Mishlei, in Proverbs, Daga b'lev ish yashchena. So it's fascinating how current this is. So it's talking about how do we handle worries? How do we handle standing on that shaky bridge in what is clearly a very fragile, shaky time? So the disagreement goes like this. Chad amar yashchena midata. One of the rabbis says, oh, the way you deal with worry is get it out of your mind, distract yourself. B'chad amar yasichena lacherim. And the other says, discuss it with others. Light up the language centers of the brain by finding somebody to talk it over with. And what's fascinating is if you look in the commentaries throughout the Talmud on who's right, who's wrong. Is it Rav Ami or Rav Asi? Is it proper for us to be distractors, to try to get our minds off something? Or is it proper for us to talk things out? And it is such an important thing to think about, because the reality is that neither is right. They're both right. It's whatever works for you. With all the research, my main background over the years is in trauma. It's in dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder. So I've been on the team that was involved in developing the one of the early iterations of post-traumatic stress disorder. And because of that secular expertise, I've been sent around the world during terrible times. So at the beginning of the Second Intifada, I spent a number of weeks in Israel dealing with people who had gone through war, had gone through repeated terror attacks. I've been in Sri Lanka after the tsunami. I've been in the Gulf after Katrina, and it doesn't matter where I go. The lesson I learn is that for some people, they do much better with distractions. They do much better with getting their minds off of things. And for other people, they do much better with talking things over. As a general rule of thumb, over time, we do better with lighting up the language centers of the brain. I have a colleague who's a very well-known expert in this area, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, been at Harvard, then at Boston University, a psychiatrist there. And we collaborated on publishing some papers in the areas of trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. And he was a little bit of a nut in terms of being totally obsessed with trying to understand trauma. And one day he comes running into my office at the hospital I used to work at, all excited, because he showed me the picture of the brain of one of his patients who was using an fMRI, was literally reliving the worst moment of his life. When after 9/11, he was pinned in the wreckage of the crumbling World Trade Center around him, and only miraculously managed to survive. And what he showed me is that, guess what the brain looks like when you're going through the worst moment of your life? What the brain looks like is Broca's area is shut down. The language centers of the brain is shut down. But then what he showed in subsequent meetings I had with him, as he gave this patient of his words for the pain and helped them light up the language centers of the brain, that's where the gradual healing of the soul and the heart took place. I'm going to share with you a story. You guys haven't heard me speak before, most of you, I imagine. And sometimes I probably spend a little too much time with telling stories, but I find when we speak to each other's right hemispheres, to our, where our heart and soul lives, you absorb that better than the whole slideshow I have prepared to share with you after this talk. Here's the story. I was in Israel, and this is going back to the beginning of the Second Intifada. This is the year 2000. And I was invited to spend a couple of weeks there working with the Death Notification Squad. Worst job in the world. This was a team of psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, and other therapists whose job was that if there was a pigua, if there was a bombing or some kind of fatal incident in Israel, their job was to go to the home, and they were in charge of notifying the mother, the father, the sister, the son, whoever the immediate family member was of the terrible tragedy, and then to just stay there with them. Maybe go with them to the funeral, maybe to help with the arrangements, and to be there with them for as long as was necessary. Probably the worst job I could possibly imagine. And they were burning out. There's a fascinating saying in the Talmud, Ein chavush matir atzmo mi beis ha'asurim. You can't free yourself from your own prison. You just can't. Right? We need outsiders sometimes to help us. So even though they knew much more about trauma than I ever will in my entire life, they needed an outsider to work with them. And I spent a very intense couple of weeks with them. Towards the end of my 2 weeks, there was a loud bomb that we heard, and it was right down the road. It was a horrible bombing. Some of you may remember this. It was in the Frank Sinatra cafeteria of the Hebrew University Har Sofim campus. And immediately, calls are coming from all over the country to the people I was lecturing. You have to go to this house and this house. Here's the name we got. I think 12 people were killed. I think 9 of them were Americans. And the place totally emptied out. So I'm sitting there. We're all in shock. And it's just me and the director of the Jerusalem Trauma Center, who is a close colleague, and the assistant director has since become a world-renowned expert in trauma. And we're just in shock, beyond words. And the phone rings again. They just discovered that a young woman who was a leader in one of the camps, one of the summer programs in the middle of the country, they just found out that she had been killed. And they didn't have anybody from the death notification squad to go there. So they looked at me, the head of the clinic looked at me and he said, "David, could you go? We have nobody else to go." He must have seen the look of terror in my eyes, not because I was afraid of doing that, but because my Hebrew is the source of endless entertainment wherever I speak when I'm in Israel. And he kindly offered to have her come. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Amy. So they offered to have her come and with me. We get to Israel, we get to the camp in the middle of the country. And I learned something that day I will never forget. I will never forget about what's happening, what do we do, and how do we handle? We're all in the middle of a hurricane now. First, there was the hurricane of COVID and the losses in many ways of our regular way of life that came with COVID. But now, there's the tsunami of the multiple kinds of stresses on us. So we get to this summer camp, and the director of the camp is certainly not going to let some American psychologists tell him what to do. Very wise, okay? He puts me and Dr. Pat Horenzik in the corner of the room, and he's not going to let us tell them that this woman just died. Wisely, he said, I should tell them. And here's what he said, and I'll never forget this, because it was seeing Rav Ami and Rav Asi come alive millennia later, okay? He says, I have 5 coping rooms. One room is you sit down and you write letters to the parents of this wonderful woman about your memories of her and express yourselves in writing. Expressing our feelings in writing helps bring order in the face of chaos. That's the first room. Second room was a music room. Express yourselves musically. This was pre-iPhone. They had all kinds of iPods set up and musical instruments. And the next room was a prayer room. Express yourselves through prayer. And the next room was a talking room where they could sit down and talk with me and my colleague. And the next room was art. So we had talking, art, music, prayer, and what have I forgotten? Writing, art, music, prayer, and it'll come to me as we go on. And what was fascinating was that the kids were told you could go from room to room throughout the day. When you finish with one room, go to the other, and which is fully what everybody was expecting. Not a single kid left their room. The talkers talked all day for hours and hours and hours. Dagab levish, yasichena la'acherim. Talk it out. Light up the language centers of the brain. As you talk, you're going to feel better. The art kids express themselves in art. The music kids with music. The writers with writing. One room wasn't chosen by anybody, the prayer room. That's probably because it was too soon for prayer. We're not ready for prayer sometimes until later on in the process, which is probably what's happening now. Many of us are raw, especially we have a lot of family in Israel and based on other kinds of tough things that have happened with us. But let me get to the punchline of this story, because it's the image that I have kind of burned in my heart and my soul. This is the end of the story. The next week, I had flown back to New York, and I was asked to give a talk for the first anniversary of the World Trade Center attacks. And I gave the talk, and the first thing I started with was the lesson I learned from the 5 coping rooms in Israel. And a woman comes over to me and she says, I have to tell you something amazing. She said, last week, Professor Elie Wiesel gave a lecture here in Manhattan. And my father was his bunkmate in the concentration camps. Literally, they shared bunks. They were next to each other. The third person in the famous picture was my best friend's father. It's probably the reason I went into PTSD to begin with. So she says that her father, as she's leaving the house to go hear Professor Wiesel, says to her, excuse me, can you please give regards to Elie? Tell him how proud we are of him. Tell him how proud we all are of his Nobel Prize, of the fact that he didn't let the world forget what we went through in those horrible places. But he says, I doubt that he'll remember me, but please just let him know how proud we are. So she goes and waits online after Professor Wiesel talks. And she says, my father is so-and-so. He doesn't think you'll remember him, but he says he wants me to share with you how proud we are. Immediately, Elie Wiesel starts to cry. He starts to cry. And he says, your father never told you that the only reason I'm alive, the only reason I'm here is because of him? Shali Shalo, what's mine, okay? Professor Wiesel said, is his. It's all because of him. She says, no, he never told me anything. And he tells the following story, okay? And then we'll figure out where we'll go after this story. But listen to this story. He says there was a day that was horrible, even by concentration camp standards. It was just beyond endurance. And a group of Russian prisoners of war got a hold of some rat poison. And they all looked at each other and said, you know something, our life is out of our control. Here's at least one thing we could do. Let's take matters into our own hands. They're going to kill us anyway. And the Russians lined up, each one taking a dose of the poison and ending their life that way. Adolescence is a time that suicide is quite contagious. And all of the adolescents in the camp looked at each other and said, hey, we could finally be in control of our lives. We could end the torture we're going through. And every one of them went on the line behind the Russian prisoners of war. He said, everyone went online except for your father, who was a Vishnitsa chassid, who believed deeply in the power of music and the power of art and the power of expressing what's on our mind and hearts and souls in a way that shares it with others. He says, your father goes off to the side of the line and he breaks into the ancient Vishnitsa nigun for Ani Mamin v'emuna shlema b'vias HaMashiach. I believe in ultimate redemption. And he says, your father's song broke our suicidal spell. One by one, we left the line. One by one, we formed a circle around your father and sang that song of faith, that ancient song of faith. He says, go home and tell your father, my Nobel Prize, it's his. Everything I've accomplished, it's because of that song. So coping comes in many different flavors, and that's an ancient wisdom that I think we have to hold on to. Now, it might be a little bit, it's going to be different. It's going to be different for different people. And sometimes we get judgmental, how come I'm not able to cry? Everybody else is able to cry. Sometimes it's hard to cry. Don't get judgmental, okay? In the early time, after very difficult periods of time, we have different approaches. Listen to what we know about tears, because what we know about tears is amazing. If you had tears this morning because of allergies, I don't know if in your neighborhood there's allergies, so this is allergy season like it is here. I'm speaking, one of you asked, I'm speaking from Great Neck, New York, about a 22-minute train ride from Midtown Manhattan down the block from me. And there's a lot of allergy seasons going on around here. So if you took one of the tears I shed this morning because of allergies and you put it under a microscope, it would be salt and water, just salt and water. Okay. But let's say you took an emotional tear that I shed, or that many of us shed as we heard about the horrible, horrible suffering, both from Meron and from more immediately from Israel, from what's going on there, of the horrific unfairness of what's going on there. And he says that if you take those emotional tears and put them under a microscope, it has a whole fascinating chemical mix. It has cortisol, releasing the stress hormone. And in fact, our rabbis tell us that shedding of tears is therapeutic, especially shedding of emotional tears. So I think that's what I wanted to have. Rabbi, tell me how much time I have before we go on to discussion. I know this will be what will probably be most valuable here would be discussion. I could go on. I haven't even said a word that I had originally planned to say, but I'll follow your lead, Rabbi.
I think if you go till 7:30 and then take questions from 7:30 to 7:45, what time do you have to go off?
I have to go on to the YU. That I have to go on to the next thing is I have to log on at 8 o'clock.
Okay, so we have time.
Yeah.
You could go another 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and take questions.
Okay, great. So let me move on to what I was originally going to say before reality has taken us over. Okay. So the first thing I want to focus on in terms of ingredients of resilience is just the power of optimism. Now, we all know some people are born in a way that they're natural pessimists. They color everything dark. Other people color everything light. Probably a certain amount of wiring behind that. But to the extent that we could cultivate optimism, which we can, there's all kinds of research, especially done by Dr. Martin Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania, that shows that in his famous book called Learned Optimism, we could teach people optimism. But let's talk about this a little bit, starting first of all with the challenge during reentry. And the challenge is that we've been dangling hard to handle uncertainty while living in the fog. And now the fog is even deeper. And I think one of the ingredients of resilience is how to learn to live with uncertainty, to learn to live with the mist. We're about to celebrate in a very short period of time the holiday of Shavuot, right? And one of the things we know is that the Torah, our source of eternal truth, was given in the Arafel, was given in the mist. The truth lies sometimes in uncertainty. And we're living at a time that it's so hard to connect to that uncertainty. It's so hard to connect to the reality that we should develop the gift that comes from recognizing this kind of ambiguity in life. I'll tell you, there's if you look through the Talmud, there's no 3 or 4 or 5 pages of the Talmud that doesn't have the following phrases in it. Kasha. Oh, it's a great question. You know something? I don't have the answer. Or tiyufta. You know what? You disproved me. You proved me wrong. I don't know. You proved me wrong. Or teku. We're never going to get the answer to this until the Mashiach comes. And there's examples of that all the time. Sort of the wisdom that our religion brings with it in terms of living with uncertainty. Challenge, though, is we're living now at a time that social media has totally derailed us in terms of there being all or nothing thinking, very little ability to live in the mist. And what I would suggest is one of the keys to being able to, I think, build this resilience is partly through this. It's partly through the ability to live in the fog, living in the fog. It's not easy, but boy, is it important. Next thing I wanted to talk about is, while we don't have control over a given situation, okay, which has certainly been our reality lately, we always have control over the meaning we give it. And I just want to share with you a few thoughts on meaning, and purpose. Thought number one is based on the research of the president of Yale. President of Yale is a man by the name of Dr. Salovey. And Dr. Salovey was a psychologist before he took over at the head of Yale. And he was the expert on understanding what are positive ways of dealing with growth and what are negative ways of dealing with growth. Okay, and what he comes to, it's all about our ability to see the growth inducing purposes, or what's called post-traumatic growth, in the face of challenge. How do we change ourselves from threat to challenge? We need to ask some basic questions. You know, how can I grow from this? You know, there's a magnificent Medrash Tehillim. Okay, this is a Medrash on the Psalms, and it goes like this. And it's I have it hung up on my refrigerator. Okay, and it goes like this. It says, in dealing with the difficult times of life, here's how to basically bring alive the wisdom of Dr. Salovey's research in terms of post-traumatic growth, and the wisdom of his cousin. Salovey is short for Soloveitchik. His cousin, Rabbi Yoshe Ber Soloveitchik, all from the same Brisker dynasties, although they didn't really know each other. And they came to the same exact conclusion, coming from different sources. My father, who was a rabbi over the years, for 65 years, was a rabbi in a synagogue in the New York area, a place called the White Shul. He calls it ancestral alchemy. Sometimes people have very kind of connections without even knowing it when they come from the same family. But listen to what it says. Ilu nafalti lo kamti. If I never fell down, I never would have gotten up. Ilu yashafti bachoshech lo hayarli. If I never sat in the darkness, I never would have appreciated the light. Phenomenally wise kind of statement. You know, Salovey in his writings talks about a famous study called the hotel maid study. Listen to the hotel maid study. They randomly assign people to two groups. One group, it's the hotel maids, and they do their regular hotel maid thing, changing sheets, dusting, vacuuming, doing whatever that job brings. I'm very high rated depression in people in that kind of job. But he randomly assigns half of this large group of hotel maids into a different group where they're told, you know something, you're part of a wellness study. You're part of an important wellness study to help us understand wellness in the workplace. So as you're dusting the high places in the room that you're dusting, you're working out your upper biceps. As you vacuum, you're working a different muscle group. And as you're walking around the room, there's a certain amount of aerobic exercise. And they're just told they do exactly the same thing as the comparison group. But guess what happens to them after, I believe it was 4 months of doing this? When for 4 months they did the job they always did, but it was invested with meaning for them, they lost a lot of weight. Their depression gave way to happiness. And it was a pretty striking kind of improvement in terms of their mood and their loving their job and their effectiveness at their job. Now, how do we bring this into our lives? The way we bring it into our lives is basically to ask ourselves, and this is something that I think COVID did for us, and the recent tragedies have done it even more clearly, which is to have us take a step back and look at meaning and purpose. Many people have, in a very positive way, been asking basic questions that we might never have asked before. Basic questions like, what's the meaning and purpose of life? How do I take a step back and value what matters most, which is time with my family? All those kinds of things. Listen to what Michael Josephson, the head of the Center for Ethics in California, said. He said, here's how you have to live your life. He says, you have to live your life by imagining yourself as a fly on the wall at your own funeral after you've lived to 120 years. And you're hearing the way that whoever is giving your eulogy is going to give your eulogy. And then he says, think about the 3 most important things that you want the people speaking at your funeral to say about you, and then live life backwards. Live life backwards. Phenomenally important kind of lesson that I think many people, from what I'm seeing, have tuned into this a little bit more. Very few people have wasted this crisis. From what I'm seeing, very few people. It's true. Some people are nervous about getting back to shul. Some people are kind of, I got a call. I'm on some committee at our shul. It's a young Israel of Great Neck. I got a call about, from the committee that's in charge of making sure that we were safe. We're lucky we have some of the leading experts in infectious diseases happen to be living here. So, we have these Columbia professors and some, Harvard professors. We have a bunch of people here who were unbelievably kept us amazingly safe in this neighborhood. But now the problem they're having, as the rabbi said, is people are afraid, just out of fear to go back. It's hard to re-enter. There was something very nice about the pause from regular life. It's been hard. And I'm personally finding it hard. There are parts, and as much suffering as so many of us have gone through, it's hard to get back. It's hard. Re-entry is really difficult. But if we recognize that and we see it as an engine of growth, that's the core of post-traumatic growth. Okay. I wanted to talk a little bit about the power of hope. The power of hope, because I think it's so incredibly important. So part of optimism is hope. I don't know if you know, the Hebrew word tikva, the Hebrew word for hope, is related to the word kav. In the middle of that word is the word kav, which means a cord. It's a cord, it's a rope, meaning that even in the darkest of times, we're not dangling in the wind at the mercy of the current. There's connection. There's connection between us and ourselves, bein adam la'atzmo, which is what many of us developed during this incredibly difficult time. There's the connection between us and God, right? A very powerful source of hope. And connection between us and our families. And here's what the Medrash tells us. Hakol b'kivui. All of our challenges have to be dealt with hope. Okay? Yisurin b'kivui. The tough times in life have to be dealt with hope. Okay? And then it says Geula, our ultimate redemption, is going to be met with kivui. I'm going to end with a story, because the other part that I haven't talked about in terms of core ingredients of resilience is the power of joy and fun, and being able to now reconnect a little bit, because it'll come. It's not disrespectful to those who are suffering to eventually be able to tune in to the holiness and the connection that comes with being able to connect to our children and to our grandchildren and to our spouses and to our community with joy. And how do you do that in the face of resilience? So I'm going to end with a final story. It'll get me right to an ending exactly on time. Here's the story. For many years, I'd been invited to Frankfurt, Germany. Frankfurt, Germany, until recently, every few years, had a conference paid for by any company in Europe who benefited from slave labor. And German law was that every few years they had to have a conference to meet the mental health needs of the ever dwindling number of survivors still living in Europe, as well as the Russian Jewish therapists who had very little in the way of Jewish background. Okay. And it was a conference, where they had, I came to talk about the Jewish end of things. And then there were really wonderful experts from around the world in trauma. I could keep you here all night with stories about the conference, but I'm going to end with a story that was it really lingers with me, because to me, it's the core of resilience. And here's the story. At the last conference, there was a man, a survivor, probably into his 70s. That's the age nowadays. And he was an adolescent in the camps. And he had suffered terribly. He told me about it in the various groups that I ran there. He told everybody about it. But he was by far the happiest man I ever met. He had a joie de vivre, simchas l'chaim, a love of life that made everybody want to be around him, because we always want to be around people who are optimists and happy. It's one of the secret powers, that together with chesed, doing for others, that are among the superpowers of resilience. So it was coming to the last day of the conference, and I thought I may never see this man again. And I was a little hesitant to do it, but I go over to him and I say, listen, I'll give him a name, Mr. Schwartz. Mr. Schwartz, please, I hope I'm not being disrespectful. You were the happiest man I ever met, and it's contagious. Even all the therapists here want to be around you because you're so inspiring. Yet you told us how you suffered as a teenager in the camps. What's the key? What's the secret sauce that leads to your joy? You look a little embarrassed. But then he said, I know exactly what it is. I'll tell you what it is. I've thought about it many times. And he was a very eloquent man. And he again repeated how horrible it was when at 3-4 in the morning, they were called out into sub-freezing temperatures in Auschwitz. And if you went too slow, the dogs would come out. If you went too slow, the dogs would come out. If you fell down, the machine guns would come out. And he says, I've often wondered what kept me going during those horrible, horrible years. What kept me going with my joy intact, even during the death march, after the initial, at the very end of our time in the camps. And he says, I'll tell you exactly what it is. He said, I developed the ability to feel the warmth of my father's hands on my head when he would bench me, when he would give me a blessing every Friday night, and to smell the sweetness of his breath when he bent down to kiss me. And that's the bottom line. The bottom line is the beauty of connection, the beauty of being able to truly be there for ourselves, for our families, for our community. That's the key. And I'll just end with the following imagery in my remaining minute. Here's the following imagery. It's one of my favorite studies. Listen to this study. They take people, these researchers take people and put them at the bottom of a hill. And they say, estimate the steepness of this hill. If you're alone, people estimate the hill as being very steep. If you have somebody at your side, the hill looks less steep. And the closer you feel to the person at your side, the less steep the hill looks and the less tired you get walking up the hill. That's the image. That's the image I wanted to leave you with before we now go to discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Pelcovitz. You definitely gave us a lot of food for thought. So once again, I want to ask anyone who has questions, and I see the first question is here from Bonnie Cohn, and please feel free to ask your questions. This is a great opportunity to talk to Dr. Pelcovitz. We could do some group therapy here with everything we're all going through right now. These have been incredibly challenging times with the news in Israel. So the first question is, do you believe that everything that happens to you in life is the will of God? And if so, how can this happen? How can this help those who have and will go through trauma?
Right. So those are if I'm hearing the question properly, which is a core question, it's partly a question of theodicy, a question of meaning making, and extremely important. I can't even begin to pretend to have the answer. What happened, again, going to the holiday we're coming up with, what happened to Moshe when he asked to understand the answer to that question, right? So even Moshe, okay, when he went up to get the Torah, even Moshe, when he asked that basic question, wasn't given an answer. But I'll just quote to you from the Kutzker, who had a brilliant mind, an incisive mind. He says, I can never believe in a God I could understand. I can never believe in a God I could understand. I have no simple answer. So again, remind me of this core question. Let me look at it on the text to make sure.
Yeah, there's a second part to the question. The question is believing that God does everything and it's the will of God. Does that help with coping? Is that an element in coping with the trauma?
Yeah. So let me. That's I knew I was missing that part. Thanks for reminding me. Yeah. So here's what my understanding is of the research, is that there's a fascinating field coming out of the University of Pennsylvania, Dr. Andrew Newberg. It's a field called Neurotheology that looked at exactly what you're asking, which is basically, does faith help us in terms of dealing with tough times, if I'm understanding the question correctly? And what he finds is that as people are able to connect with the faith, which is sometimes very hard, but if we're able to connect with a real belief and with an understanding that God is by our side, even though we may be angry and even though we may have a hard time with even accepting some of the crazy kind of things that happen, what Dr. Newberg finds is that the more faith a person has, the more their anxiety centers quiet down. So faith brings with it a diminution of anxiety. There's a professor at Harvard Medical School in Brookline by the name of Dr. David Rosemarin, who's published a number of fascinating articles. He happens to be an observant guy, but a brilliant guy. And what Dr. Rosemarin found, what he reported, is that he works with people. Okay, so these are people who were looking for this kind of work, on helping them work on their faith. So there's a famous book by Rabbeinu Bachya going back to the Middle Ages, and it has Shar HaBitachon, ways of developing your faith. It's available in English. It's available, of course, in Hebrew. And what he finds in a number of papers published in the leading psychology journals, peer-reviewed psychology journals, is that as people develop their ability to believe through familiarizing themselves with some of these Jewish writings, their anxiety levels improve very significantly. And it's a fascinating thing to look at. I think there's a website that Dr. Rosemarin has that has a lot of his papers on this talked about. And it's it used to be called, I'm trying to think of what the current thing is, but if you just put in David Rosemarin Center for Anxiety, he has offices in different parts of New York City and in the Brookline area, and he's a professor at Harvard. His stuff is exactly focusing on what you're asking here.
Thank you, Dr. Pelcovitz. Next question. My daughter, Rachel, is 18 years old, and she has been living in Jerusalem since September 2020. She is supposed to come home in 2 weeks, and I'm feeling very fearful for her being alone there during this tragic time. I'm trying to remain positive, but it is very hard. Any suggestions?
Yeah. So do you know what the level of support, psychological support her school is offering?
I don't know. Madeline, if you know and want to type in what support the school is offering.
Because most schools are, first of all, the kids in most schools are organized around pods. She attends Stern College, so she's alone in Jerusalem. Oh, I see. So she's all alone.
That's Stern College in Jerusalem.
Oh, okay. So she's, from what I understand, then there's a tremendous amount. I mean, I've given a number of talks together with colleagues on this. She went to Israel with her friends and lives in an apartment. Okay, so that's helpful to know. I'll just tell you that what I've seen for the most part, it's been tough for kids, especially with the Meron now coupled with the war. But the key is, what are some of the ingredients of resilience in this kind of situation? Number one is what I'm hearing, and in the talks I've given to that community, because because of my job, I've heard over and over again that the members of various pods have been connected with each other, and somebody like your daughter, I would imagine that she has all kinds of a support system, hopefully. If she doesn't, it's very easy. There's a wonderful, really excellent counseling center at Stern College that, and I'm not just saying it because I happen to be there, but the therapists there are amazing. They really are. They're, they are extremely talented. They're, I think almost all of them are, they have advanced degrees, they're all licensed, but more importantly, they're warm, supportive, terrific people. And what I'll say is that what happened 7 years ago, after the Gaza war, after the last war in Gaza, we had 40 students come back from Israel, most of them Golani, most of them fighting in the crack combat troops in Gaza, okay? And they came back and they were having a hard time. But they got really excellent support by experts in trauma, which there's plenty of experts in trauma in the New York area and as well as in every area. And the norm was resilience. With time and with being given a chance to put words to their pain. I'm not saying I don't want to be a Pollyanna, okay? But what the resilience was very much the norm. Maybe a little bit of a tough reentry, but the key is, what are the three superpowers I'd recommend? Number one is to get her involved if she can in any kind of chesed that she can. Okay, there's nothing quite as powerful in terms, I've been hearing this from Israel all day today, you know, people saying, you know, help others. You have to help others, right? The Hebrew word natan, to give, is a palindrome, because when you give, you get back. The second superpower is gratitude, to focus on what you have. And the third is basically the ability to connect from the bottom of the hill that I talked about before. But she doesn't have to do it alone. There's really, you know, tremendous, I believe, tremendous amount of support. And the anyway, so that's for that. So and I imagine you're in touch with her, you know, always over the phone, right?
Thank you, Rabbi. Doctor, anyone who has questions, please feel free to type them in. Dr. Pelcovitz, here's my personal dilemma. I wanted to get your opinion on it. You know, on the one hand, we want to watch what's going on in Israel. You know, there's constant reports and videos are coming across your phone and so on and so forth. And you want to, you know, you want to feel connected to what the plight of the Jews in Israel are. But the more you look at the rockets flying and the devastation and the tragedies, the more depressed you become, the more gloomy and hopeless things, you know, the rioting and the infighting in Israel and the chaos. And it's not only, by the way, coming out of Israel. I mean, we saw images of a demonstration in New York where a Jewish man was bleeding from his head and Arabs were running after him. And I don't know if you've seen this video. That's
Yeah, horrible images.
just
Yeah.
going on in New York City, and you feel like between the anti-Semitism and the terrorism, and then there's zero sympathy from the media. They equate the two sides like there's a conflict on two equal sides, and you feel like you're drowning in an ocean of anti-Semitism, and you know so much negativity and you know, so much sadness. So then you say, you know what, I'm not going to look at my phone anymore. It's too depressing. But then you feel like, but my family's suffering. I have to see what's going on. So what would you recommend to be in tune with every news report coming out of Israel, minute by minute, hour by hour, or tuning out some of that?
So let me share with you what the research is. Going back to Oklahoma City when the first studies were done, but shown over and over again in multiple studies, that were repeatedly found the same thing. If you have an anxious temperament, if you're a warrior, if you have a lot of tough stuff going on in your life, maybe financial pressures, maybe recent losses or past losses, if you're a person who's maybe prone to having problems regulating mood, watching stuff in an sort of like in an uncensored way is really going to put you at tremendously increased risk for having a PTSD kind of reaction to what's going on. The reports that are pretty consistent, you know, based on a lot of studies done in many different kinds of wars, is that doom scrolling, as I'm sure you've heard, doom scrolling is bad for you, sort of emptily picking up your phone and looking for the worst kind of things. Doesn't mean, obviously, we need to be nosei b'ol chavero in order to feel the empathy and feel the connection with our fellow Jews. Sure, we need to make ourselves aware of it. But I would say that there's no reason why we can't limit ourselves to even 15 minutes in the morning, 15 minutes at night, but to put some kind of a limit on it. We're gonna be much more effective in being able to deal with this and help our family members and our community deal with it if we put a little bit of and it's not at all, I think, a lack of empathy. On the contrary, you know, I'm sure you know that at a certain point you start to hear and read the same things over and over again. I would not recommend reading certain papers, which can get you totally crazy. I would not recommend looking at it really is, I get so aggravated. It's been so aggravating what's been happening in the last, you know, since this all started. It's beyond belief because it's so clueless. It's so completely and utterly clueless about what's going on. And I can't imagine the single person who's pontificating about how dare you, knock down buildings, and how dare you, take innocent lives, as if Israel doesn't torture themselves, and do everything we can to protect innocent lives, sometimes putting our own sons and daughters who are in the army in danger. And I think we just have to, we have to monitor it. We have to protect ourselves. And I can almost guarantee you that tops half hour in the morning, half hour at night, but certainly not more than that, especially if you have the kind of temperament I was talking about, or the kind of history that I'm talking about. Does that kind of answer it, or?
Yeah.
Yeah. By the way, if I could just say one side thing. During 9/11, I was very, very involved in 9/11 because not too far from where I am here, there was a huge number of people. There's one block about a 10-minute walk away from here where 8 parents were killed on that block in the World Trade Center. Okay, because they worked on the high floors in Cantor Fitzgerald, and this area has a lot of people in the financial industry. Okay, not in the Jewish community, in the actually the Irish Catholic community. And I was sort of like a co-researcher in some of the work on answering the question you just asked about how dangerous media watching can be. So, and I was preaching against it because we already knew how dangerous it could be during the weeks after 9/11. And then I discovered, as we were piloting some research instruments, so I gave it to my 4 kids. And I discovered that one of my daughters was totally obsessed with what was going on. And she was sneaking downstairs to the basement of my house and watching CNN nonstop. Okay. And I had no idea, and just to tell you, sometimes, you look at things long term, and she's today if I could brag a little bit about her, she's a professor at Cornell Medical School, New York Hospital, Westchester, and she's pretty respected expert in post-traumatic stress disorder. She went into her father's business, publishing a lot about all these things. She was naturally drawn to it, but now she's actually somebody I call her for advice all the time, about certain cases, certain people I'm stuck with. So, there's also the long-term thing to think about. Yeah. What other questions there?
If anyone has any other questions, feel free, please, to type in your questions. It goes without saying, I'm assuming, but I just want to verify that getting involved in, like yesterday, there was a local demonstration, a rally to support Israel here in West Palm Beach.
Mm-hmm.
And I went, and many others went, to stand with Israeli flags and show support. Obviously, getting involved in whatever we can do from here would be a good idea.
Oh yeah, listen, it's real necessity, I think. It's helping others is this, I think, the single most powerful ingredient of resilience. I was hearing I-24 news earlier today, and there was a woman from Straus who was being interviewed. And she was asked about, what she's recommending, because Straus knows so much about this. This has been their life nonstop for years. And her main recommendation was, the only way I know I could get through this and I could help my kids go through it is to help others.
Right.
To help others,
Dr. Pelcovitz, to go back to the initial conversation about COVID-19 and resilience. As a rabbi, I'm watching what's happening, and I would say, the majority of people are coming back to the synagogue, to functions, to whatever degree, indoor, outdoor, whatever it may be. But when you encounter someone who is just not changing any of their protocol. Whatever they were doing a year ago in May of 2020, or going even back to March and April of 2020, they're literally still doing the same thing. They're not leaving their house. They got double vaccinated, they're just not leaving. And as a rabbi, I look at some of these people and I say, this person lives alone. They're looking at the same four walls 24 hours a day. They're not coming to shul like they would every Shabbos in the past. They're not engaging with people. And from my perspective, which is limited, obviously, I think, okay, there are risks of coming out and being around people, but what about the downside of sitting home all this time and not being with friends and family? And I guess my question is, I try to encourage lightly, maybe you should consider this or that, but do you respect people's comfort levels and say, listen, it's your choice, or do you try to lean on them a little bit? Is it the right thing to try to push them in the direction of coming out?
Yeah, it's funny. It's exactly what we're dealing with in this community. Exactly what I think both the lay leadership and rabbinic leadership of this community has been struggling with anxiety. 1 in 6 people are wired in a way that they're anxious. Pretty common style to have. It only flips into anxiety disorder if it's totally interfering with their functioning, if it's pervasive, persistent, interfering with functioning. I think that with time, the hope is they'll come back. They'll come back. But I would gently push them. The key guideline on dealing with anxiety is to avoid avoidance. It's to confront your fears. And as you confront your fears, things start to gradually give way to gradual re-entry in a healthier kind of way. So a gentle push, if you can, and encouragement, but without being judgmental, and with mostly to be understood, first understand, hear a little bit what they're concerned about. Could be that they've had some loss in their family. It could be, my guess is that it's probably tied, tied to, some reasonable concerns having to do with things that may have very little to do with what it apparently is. But again, to be understood, first understand. Remember the Hebrew word ozen, Hebrew word for ear, is etymologically tied to the word maznayim, which is a scale, right? The inner ear is the source of balance. So listen, gently, maybe encourage, depending on your relationship with them. But what's this? Okay, yeah. So, but it's for people in that category, it's probably going to have to be a little, slower than it is for other people. I'm going to have to go to my next talk. I'm doing the YU Shuos thing.
Thank you very much, Dr.
Thank you.
Pelcovitz. And,
Thank you. It was great seeing you all.
I wish you a good Yantiv, a good Shabbos, and a Chag Sameach.
You too.
Thank you everyone for joining, and thank you for the fabulous talk, and have a wonderful evening. And to Madeline, our condolences. It's obviously after COVID and losing a loved one, there could be nothing worse, and we feel your pain.
I'm so sorry. I didn't see that. Sorry to hear.
Someone made a comment that they can't go back to the way it was pre-COVID because.
So let me end with that. Absolutely. Everybody has their own challenges, but there's nothing as valid as somebody who's experienced a direct tragedy, needing to pull back, and that's totally important.
Absolutely. Well, okay. Thank you again, everyone, and have a good night. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye, Latov.
Right, good night.